Diplomat Averell Harriman called it a sour little war, but the Korean War was to mark a turning point in American post-war strategy. It was the first step in a long series of ventures that would lead to Vietnam, Central America, and other points on the globe. Korea has been called the key to Asia, and its misfortune has been to lie at the crossroads to that land mass. Its history is one of conquest and occupation. Japan, China, and Russia have all attempted to dominate here in the past. Prior to World War II, Japan had occupied Korea, and it was used as a staging area for Japan's invasion of Manchuria in 1931. As World War II drew to a close, the Allies met at Yalta to discuss the shape of the post-war world. Germany was crumbling under their combined pressure, and the U.S. was preparing an invasion of Japan. The Japanese had vowed to fight to the death to protect their homeland. It was estimated that 1 million Americans would die in a Japanese invasion. Soviet help would be required. In return for this, the U.S. would allow Stalin to create buffer states. The plan was endorsed by General Douglas MacArthur. The Soviets would move on Manchuria before the U.S. invasion. MacArthur, well aware of the political implications of such an offer to Russia, insisted that Soviet participation was crucial to an American victory. The atomic bombs dropped at Hiroshima and Nagasaki ended the war, and invasion plans were canceled. But Russia, in the meantime, had fulfilled its pledge, invaded Manchuria, and was rapidly advancing on Korea. Events had been set in motion that would move far beyond Japan's surrender. Dean Rusk and Colonel Bonesteel, fearing that a Soviet victory would embrace all of Korea, recommended a demarcation line. It was to be the 38th parallel. Russia accepted, and Korea was, once again, divided. Syngman Rhee, a lifelong nationalist, was proclaimed president of South Korea. An undersecretary of the Army, acting in the interest of the National Security Council, suggested that Korea was of little value strategically and recommended to President Truman that America withdraw. The National Security Council had concluded that American troops on Korean soil could lead to further problems, even disaster. But two events were to forever alter that first American reaction. In 1948, a beaten nationalist army under Chiang Kai-shek fell to communist forces in China. A year later, in August of 1949, the Soviet Union exploded an atomic bomb of its own. In April of 1950, National Security Council Policy Statement No. 68 was completed. This document was to become the basis for U.S. foreign policy in the post-war world. It called for rapid deployment of weapons and assistance to U.S. allies in Europe and Asia. In the process, America would have to be rearmed. The costs would be staggering. The government began a public opinion campaign to convince the American people.
The real threat to our security isn't the danger of bankruptcy. It is the danger of communist aggression. If communism is allowed to absorb the free nations one by one, then we would be isolated from our sources of supply and detached from our friends. Then we would have to take defense measures that might really bankrupt our economy and change our way of life so that we couldn't recognize it as American any longer. That's the very thing we're trying to keep from happening.
In the 5 years that have passed since the end of the war, we have been confronted with a new, powerful imperialism. We had hoped that our wartime ally, the Soviet Union, would join in the efforts of the whole community of nations to build a peaceful world. Instead, the Soviet leaders have been an obstacle to peace. By means of infiltration, subversion, propaganda, and indirect aggression, the rulers of the Soviet Union have sought to extend the boundaries of their totalitarian control. with a cynical disregard for the hopes of mankind, the leaders of the Soviet Union have talked democracy and have set up dictatorships. They have proclaimed national independence, but imposed national slavery. They have preached peace, but devoted their energies to fomenting aggression and preparing for war.
Secretary of State Dean Acheson, speaking in Dallas at the time, had said, "We should not pull down the blinds and sit in the parlor waiting." Public opinion was being mobilized, but this was a policy that needed a crisis. South Korean President Ri made no secret of his plans to unite both North and South Korea, nor was North Korean Premier Kim Sung silent on his plans for South Korea. In 1949 and 50, North Korea began to build its army. By the spring of 1950, the North Koreans had put 135,000 troops into the field. Sung, confident that his forces could defeat those of South Korea, moved to confer with Joseph Stalin. According to former Russian Premier Nikita Khrushchev, Stalin agreed that Sung could win. American intelligence, despite clear evidence of the North Korean mobilization, gave MacArthur no indication of an impending attack on the South. In light of the historical record, it is difficult to believe that MacArthur had no indication of the North Korean buildup. Railroad terminals in the north had been shut down, and troops were massed all along the parallel. MacArthur had developed a close relationship with South Korea's Syngman Rhee, and in 1949 had stated to him that "I would defend South Korea as I would defend the shores of my own native land." Rhee would remember these words, but despite tremendous evidence to the contrary, Rhee apparently made no mention to MacArthur of an impending attack from the north. 7 days prior to the invasion, John Foster Dulles of the American State Department visited Korea. Dulles had helped father the Korean Republic as the UN representative who called for the creation of South Korea. Strangely, neither Dulles nor Rhee nor MacArthur spoke of the possibility of an invasion. An invasion may have been foreseen, and perhaps this event alone was what the West had waited for it would unite the Western world as no other post-war event had done. MacArthur had long fought for a separate peace with Japan, a peace which would place her squarely in the Western camp and allow for American bases. Was Korea the answer to this strategic question? Chiang Kai-shek's beaten army had reformed on the island of Formosa with American help, and the U.S. would have further reason to rearm when it became clear that America's most vulnerable Asian outpost, Formosa, could come under attack from China. U.S. senators warned of the consequences of Asian involvement, but forces had been set in motion which were to make Korea the key to a world crisis.
Korea is a small country, thousands of miles away. But what is happening there is important to every American. On Sunday, June 25th, Communist forces attacked the Republic of Korea. Free nations must be on their guard, more than ever before, against this kind of sneak attack.
North Korea struck hard. 90,000 troops and 150 T-34 tanks poured through the South Korean defenses. The tanks had given the North an overwhelming advantage against the hastily organized South Koreans. By Monday, June 26th, the news from the South was disastrous on all fronts. The North Koreans were sweeping through everything in their path in a six-pronged blitz that was gathering momentum. American Secretary of State Dean Acheson made 3 immediate recommendations. Provide the South Koreans with American arms, make the American Air Force available to the South Koreans for air cover, and thirdly, using the 7th Fleet in the Philippines, head off an anticipated attack by China on Formosa. For fear of provoking a larger war, American strategists initially proposed limiting American involvement to arms shipments. On June 27th, things changed. But a question remains unanswered to this day. Why had America so quickly shifted to a full-scale military intervention? It is now assumed that Dulles and MacArthur had lobbied for complete intervention. Clearly, Truman had agreed. The U.S. quickly turned to the United Nations for aid. Even though the Soviet Union boycotted the Security Council, the U.S. had succeeded in passing its amendment, committing the UN to intervention in Korea. MacArthur was to be given a blank check. He was to command a UN force without restraint from the UN. On July 7th, England and France, in an unprecedented move, had jointly sponsored a resolution in the UN giving MacArthur supreme command. The Selective Service in the U.S. was granted wartime status. It was an astonishing series of developments. MacArthur and Dulles had a navy at their command, wartime conscription at home, and absolute control conferred by UN resolution. America was at war, and so were her allies.
The free nations have now made it clear that lawless aggression will be met with force. The free nations have learned the fateful lesson of the 1930s. That lesson is that aggression must be met firmly. Appeasement leads only to further aggression and ultimately to war.
MacArthur, convinced that air power would be decisive, moved to stop the North Korean advance. He failed. The North Korean drive continued as a rapidly disintegrating South Korean army dwindled from 98,000 to 22,000 men. MacArthur stepped up the air attacks. They began to slow the North Korean advance. MacArthur, confident that the tide was turning, assured news reporter Marguerite Higgins that, quote, "Given 2 divisions, I can hold Korea." But American troops making their way to Korea for the first time were ill-prepared for what they would find. Unprepared for the rough terrain and the well-coordinated advance of the North Korean army. The only question remaining was, could UN and South Korean troops survive until help arrived? With Seoul captured and Rhee and his government routed, the North Koreans set up their own regime. Many South Koreans were sympathetic. As early as 1950, socialist candidates in South Korea had won more seats than the government of Rhee. CIA intelligence indicated that many South Koreans were happy to see Rhee gone. Under increasing pressure, MacArthur asked for 4 more divisions. It was becoming increasingly clear that MacArthur would require more and more troops. But a conflict was developing. On one side, MacArthur and John Foster Dulles. On the other, Truman and the Joint Chiefs of Staff. It was a conflict that would continue and in its way influence American policy to the end of the war. Americans were increasingly concerned about reports from the front lines. Throughout July of that first year of the war, the situation deteriorated. North Korean forces drove the UN command further and further south, down the Korean peninsula. Hundreds of thousands of refugees followed the fleeing army. It was to become a commonplace of this conflict. Entire families carrying their belongings on their backs, casualties of the war. North Korea had counted on a quick victory. They had planned to overrun the South Korean forces within the first weeks of the war, before the UN command arrived. The tide began to turn. General Walker slowed and then stopped the North Korean advance. Walker had men and supplies. The time had come for a counterattack, and MacArthur announced his plans to the world. He would buy time, and then surprise the North Koreans with a flanking attack. On September 1st, the North Koreans, sensing that time was running out, launched a last-ditch effort to drive the UN forces into the sea. Short of supplies, the North Korean army suffered some of its worst casualties of the war. The drive was stopped. MacArthur, based on his World War II experience, favored surprise amphibious landings. With the North Koreans stretched dangerously thin, he planned to strike behind them and trap their forces. He settled on a place called Incheon. The UN commander threw everything he had at the island of Woli and at the Incheon defenses. The naval bombardment directed at the targets was to equal in intensity those at Omaha Beach during the Normandy invasion. It was a formidable show of firepower. The Marines met limited resistance. Incheon had been taken. By the end of the day, 18,000 American troops were ashore, and MacArthur had, with a single stroke, changed the course of the war. The North Koreans were now fighting on two fronts. Pounded from the air, the North Koreans pulled back. They dug in before Seoul, and the fighting was now house to house. The city was to be utterly destroyed. Seoul was of no military advantage, but as capital of South Korea, it had a propaganda value. MacArthur had trapped the North Korean army. By taking the capital, he would allow the North Koreans to escape. But the U.S. now faced the war's next crisis. What would it mean should American troops cross the 38th parallel? It was not to be an easy decision. MacArthur insisted, with Rhee's support, that he be allowed to pursue the North Korean army, destroy it, and make Rhee the single ruler both north and south. I intend to destroy the North Korean forces. I may need to occupy all of Korea to do so. China moved quickly to make its intentions clear. Zhou Enlai, with Mao's approval, announced to the world China would not sit idly by and watch the Americans invade. Diplomat George Kennan pointed out that both China and the Soviet Union would be threatened should MacArthur move north. His warning was ignored. American strategists had forgotten Korea was not just an American problem. China had interests of her own, and she would fight to maintain them. MacArthur had made it clear he might have to go to the Yalu River, to the very river which China used to supply electricity for all of Chinese Manchuria. On October 3rd, MacArthur indicated to the New York Times that he was prepared to go to the Yalu and beyond. MacArthur was now to make a series of far-reaching decisions. President Harry S. Truman had agreed that he would abide by any UN decision on the war. But before Truman or the UN could be heard, MacArthur acted. He called for the unconditional surrender of North Korea. MacArthur's declaration had two consequences. It killed any chance for peace talks, and it meant that the war would not stop at the 38th parallel. The war was now rapidly outpacing the complex diplomatic maneuvers which surrounded it. MacArthur and elements of the U.S. State Department felt that now the time had come to unite the two Koreas, North and South. In October, the UN had passed a resolution allowing the South Koreans to advance north of the 38th parallel. But by early October, the South Koreans had already crossed the parallel. In fact, as the UN debate was taking place, on October the 3rd, South Korean forces were already 50 miles north of the 38th parallel. They were to take Kosong with the help of American air and sea support. The rapid South Korean advance posed no immediate problem for the UN, as the South Korean forces had destroyed the North Korean army opposing them. But the advance did serve a political purpose. It put South Korean forces in control of as much of North Korea as was possible. By October the 7th, it was clear that the UN could do little but accede to the wishes of MacArthur and Washington. It was becoming that sour little war which Averell Harriman would later describe. Stalin had consented to the North Korean invasion of the South. Now MacArthur and Washington had destroyed any chance for an early peace settlement. On October the 9th, the full-scale invasion of North Korea was underway. On October the 14th, Pyongyang was taken. The North Koreans offered little resistance, and by October the 19th, the UN had taken full control of the city. In the eastern and western sections of North Korea, UN and South Korean forces pushed ahead. Clearly worried, Truman, frustrated by MacArthur's insubordination, moved to meet with him personally. Truman's memoirs note that he wanted a personal meeting with MacArthur for a specific reason. No matter what MacArthur might think of him personally, Truman was his commander-in-chief and MacArthur's superior. But there was another factor. On October the 8th, MacArthur had apparently approved the bombing of a Soviet airdrome. The field lay 60 miles inside the Soviet Union. An enraged Soviet ambassador lodged a stern protest with Washington the next day, and Truman announced immediately that he would be meeting with MacArthur on the 10th of October. Truman was clearly not happy with MacArthur, but more frightening still was the fact that MacArthur's path could lead to a Third World War. They met, and MacArthur gave Truman assurances that the Chinese would not enter the war. Truman left happy after he had made his point. MacArthur returned to his troops as they advanced 50 and now 100 miles past the lines approved by the Joint Chiefs of Staff. With these advances came evidence of North Korean atrocities. South Korean and American troops had been starved and murdered, left in the wake of a panicking army. The UN forces continued to advance, and the Yalu River became MacArthur's next objective. In violation of his orders, he would advance to the very borders of China itself. The Joint Chiefs of Staff were again disturbed. 6 months later, during hearings, General Collins was to confess, quote, "It led us gradually to fear that just as he violated a policy without consulting us, perhaps the thing might be done in some other instance of a more serious nature." The war was about to take on a new dimension. Chinese forces moved to protect electrical plants. On October the 24th, the U.S. command announced that foreign troops, meaning non-Korean troops, would halt 40 miles from the Manchurian border so as not to provoke China. For the first time, South Korean troops began to encounter Chinese soldiers. UN Tokyo headquarters dismissed these reports. MacArthur now pushed past the 40-mile buffer zone and up to the Yalu River. By October the 28th, it was almost impossible to believe that MacArthur did not know of the Chinese intervention. Reports from the field had confirmed that the Chinese were in North Korea. All during this time, reconnaissance flights could not have missed Chinese troop movements. But the question remains: why did the 8th Army spokesman ridicule the reports? In a report to the National Security Council, MacArthur had said that as early as October the 16th, UN forces had made contact with the Chinese 40 miles north of Hamhung. If military intelligence knew of the crossing, why did they wait until November the 7th to say something about it? The reason may be that if the Chinese encounters were made public, MacArthur would have been forced to withdraw back within the established buffer zones. On November the 1st, the Chinese struck General Walker's 8th Army. Walker's army had advanced far beyond the line of prudence, and the Chinese struck at his open flank. The brave men of the 8th Army suffered severe casualties. On November the 3rd, the United States Marines moved to attack the Chongqing Reservoir. 10 days earlier, the Chinese had moved in to protect the area. Strange statistics began to emerge from MacArthur's headquarters. On October the 30th, a spokesperson had estimated enemy casualties at 460,000 troops. By November the 4th, the same command insisted that the North Koreans had just as many men in the field as had existed during the peak period of the war, and this despite the staggering losses claimed by the American High Command. MacArthur may have been trying to avoid acknowledging direct intervention by the Chinese, but his old friend Chiang Kai-shek was not deceived, nor was he discreet. Whatever Chinese communist involvement may mean to the rest of the world, Chiang said, to nationalist China it means new hope and restored confidence. Chiang went on to say that business was on the upswing on Formosa, and he looked forward to joining the fight against the communists in Korea. Chiang Kai-shek's words fell on fertile ground as Republican senators in Washington urged that the U.S. accept the offer of nationalist Chinese help. Meanwhile, MacArthur moved to bomb targets along the Yalu River, destroying the city of Sunwiji in the process. A contradictory U.S. command issued a report that only military installations were being targeted. The report also revealed that 90% of the city had been demolished. On the battlefield, the Chinese had broken off contact and moved northward. MacArthur was to tell the Joint Chiefs that just as soon as the 8th Army could be resupplied, he intended to resume his offensive. For fear of offending MacArthur and critics of the administration, America was heading rapidly for disaster. MacArthur's Home by Christmas offensive was planned to begin on November the 15th, but was canceled until November the 24th. The dates are interesting. The Chinese UN delegation was to arrive at the UN on November the 15th, but had postponed its arrival until November the 24th. It cannot be proven that MacArthur changed his battle plan to coincide with the arrival of the Chinese delegation to the UN, but he was aware that the Chinese would arrive on these dates. If there was to be any discussion of peace, it would be difficult, if not impossible, for the Chinese to talk while they were being attacked. It would strain the law of probability to suggest that MacArthur's battle plan and the arrival of the Chinese UN delegation was a coincidence. Clearly, American generals are aware of the political implications of what they do, as are their rivals. Never in the history of warfare had a general so clearly told his plans to the enemy. That MacArthur was ready to move was no secret to anyone. The London Times reported that this was, quote, certainly a curious way to fight a war. All of this was to cost many American lives in the coming days of the war. The Chinese withdrawal could be interpreted in several ways. First, China had given up on Korea and was withdrawing to Manchuria. Second, a trap was being set. If the Chinese were withdrawing, MacArthur had no reason to provoke them. If a trap was being set, why did MacArthur walk into it? He himself felt that a trap had been set, but he had marched on, and into the dragon's mouth.
Based on what I've seen, the conferences I've had with General MacArthur and his principal field commanders, I'm sure that while the situation there is serious, that our forces will be able to take care of themselves without further serious losses.
On November the 25th, the Chinese hit the 8th Army. By the next day, the 8th Army was beginning to fall apart. Flanked on both sides by vastly superior numbers, the 8th Army reeled back from the Yalu River. It had quickly become clear that MacArthur's offensive had been completely halted. But General Walker's job remained. He must save what was left of the American 8th Army. In the east, the Marines were completely surrounded by the Chinese. For 2 full days, MacArthur and his staff received reports of the deteriorating situation and did nothing. A full 2 days after the Chinese offensive had begun, the Marines received word. They were to retreat. The Marines began the long, slow ordeal which was to bring them to Hung Nam. Many were to die along the way in the cold and treacherous terrain. On arriving at Hung Nam, the Marines would begin an Incheon in reverse. They would pull out and regroup at the Pusan perimeter. By December the 14th, the Marines had evacuated Hung Nam. Washington now began to see the depth of the disaster that MacArthur had brought upon the UN forces. The general's first public statement was almost incredible. MacArthur maintained that his offensive had caught the Chinese by surprise and had forced the enemy into a premature engagement. On the home front, Truman was in trouble.
Though the present situation is dangerous, we do not believe that war is inevitable. There is no conflict between the legitimate interests of the free world and those of the Soviet Union that cannot be settled by peaceful means. We will continue to take every honorable step we can to avoid general war, but we will not engage in appeasement. The world learned from Munich that security cannot be bought by appeasement.
The Democratic majority in the House and Senate were down, from 12 to 2 in the Senate and from 17 to 12 in the House. Senator Robert Taft of Ohio saw the results as a clear road to the White House in 1952. After failing to get the Republican nomination in 1944 and 1948, Taft was now like a shark who smelled blood. Taft and the infamous Senator Joseph McCarthy sought to, and succeeded, in portraying Secretary of State Dean Acheson as soft on communism. The incident stands as one of the most ridiculous ironies in the history of American politics. Acheson, who had shaped the Truman Doctrine, thereby keeping Greece and Turkey from a pro-communist government. Acheson, an architect of the Marshall Plan and later the Berlin Airlift, and of NATO, was a staunch Cold Warrior. And clearly, the Soviets did not share the view that Mr. Acheson was soft on communism. On December 22nd, General Walker was killed in an automobile accident. He was replaced by General Matthew B. Ridgway. At the same time, Seoul was being burned and abandoned. MacArthur, who had retreated so quickly that he lost contact with the Chinese, now called openly for the bombing of China, a blockade of the Chinese coast, the introduction of the nationalist Chinese into Korea, and operations by the nationalists against the Chinese coast. MacArthur felt that this was the only course open to the UN forces, were they to continue the war. But MacArthur was more and more distant now, his authority eroding. The day-to-day operations of the war fell to General Ridgway. Ridgway's orders were clear. Retreat if you have to, but make the Chinese pay for every inch of territory.
Surely by now it must be clear to them, beyond any shadow of doubt, that they are incapable, with their own resources, of destroying the United Nations forces in Korea or of driving them into the sea, as they continue to boast they will. It must be equally clear to Chinese communist leaders that the attainment of either of these objectives would be possible only if they were able to secure very large quantities of all types of arms and equipment, including aircraft, artillery, and tanks, and the ammunition, therefore, from their professed friend and ally.
By late January, General Ridgway was ready to begin an offensive. This time, the 8th Army and the 10th Corps were under one command. The advance moved slowly but steadily, but at Hong Song, the Chinese counterattacked, and there ensued some of the heaviest fighting of the war. The UN forces held on, and there was no Chinese breakthrough. MacArthur had wanted no part of an ever more disastrous Korean campaign and had been quick to distance himself from the situation. But as conditions under Ridgway began to improve, MacArthur was just as quick to renew his interest in the war. MacArthur, infuriating Ridgway in the process, announced to the press that the 8th Army was ready to go on the offensive again. Ridgway insisted MacArthur had betrayed his plans to the world. But if MacArthur's ego was growing larger with improved fortunes, it was to cost lives. The 8th Army did begin to advance, and UN forces formed a stable battle line across the center of the Korean peninsula. In the east, UN forces advanced to the 38th parallel. Acheson now moved on the diplomatic level. He offered the Chinese a ceasefire. The Chinese rejected the offer and repeated their earlier demands. China was to be seated at the UN, and America was to withdraw from Formosa. But the UN declared China the aggressor in Korea by a vote of 44-7. It was a stunning blow to Chinese prestige and a victory for U.S. foreign policy.
The reply of the Chinese communists to the United Nations ceasefire proposal is still further evidence of their contemptuous disregard of a worldwide demand for peace. Their so-called counter-proposal is nothing less than an outright rejection. Once again, the Beiping regime has shown a total lack of interest in a peaceful settlement of the Korean question.
On March the 7th, Ridgway launched the offensive to split the North Korean army from the Chinese army. The attack was successful, and UN forces moved up to the 38th parallel again. The question was posed once again: would the UN forces cross the parallel and widen the war? The decision was finally made: secure the line at the parallel and begin negotiations to end the war. The confrontation between MacArthur and Truman had reached its climax. MacArthur's attacks on the administration continued unabated. MacArthur's downfall began in 1947 with the formation of the National Security Agency. This secret agency was created to monitor both enemy and ally alike. In the Far East, at Atsuju Air Force Base in Japan, the main station was formed for monitoring the Chinese. Spying can prove to be an embarrassing and damaging business, and particularly so when one is caught. In 1951, two friendly nations, Spain and Portugal, with which MacArthur had close relations, were being monitored by the American Embassy at Tokyo. These documents contained messages from MacArthur setting out his plan to dispose of the Chinese question through a transformation of the Korean conflict into a larger war with mainland China. At this time, Director Paul Nietzsche and Associate Charles Burton of the State Department were attempting to formulate policy which would end the Korean conflict. Truman announced that MacArthur's cables were quote-unquote outright treachery and left Truman no choice but to relieve MacArthur of his command. Truman wished to avoid public awareness of the sources of his information about MacArthur. To go public would mean compromising America's newly formed security network. MacArthur's own public statements directed at widening the war and critical of the administration gave Truman ample reason for dismissing the general. MacArthur began to criticize Ridgway's "make the Chinese pay" tactics. China could not be contained in Asia simply by killing Chinese soldiers. MacArthur maintained that Chinese power to make war must be destroyed. MacArthur's offensive tactics flew in the face of a UN plan to stabilize a battle line and then begin immediate negotiations to end the war. The 8th Army had stopped at the 38th parallel, and MacArthur was again critical of the decision. With both Chinese and American lines stabilized at the 38th parallel, Truman made an immediate offer to begin negotiations. Upon hearing that, MacArthur issued an insultingly worded offer of his own to the Chinese. MacArthur had once again defied stated American policy. Truman now had the ammunition he needed. MacArthur was to be removed. Truman moved to meet with his cabinet and the Joint Chiefs of Staff over the issue. Should he fire MacArthur? The answer was unanimous. MacArthur must go. Truman moved immediately with the backing of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and his cabinet to relieve MacArthur of his command.
I have therefore considered it essential to relieve General MacArthur so that there would be no doubt or confusion as to the real purpose and aim of our policy. It was with the deepest personal regret that I found myself compelled to take this action. General MacArthur is one of our greatest military commanders. But the cause of world peace is much more important than any individual.
But MacArthur was to return home a hero. Hundreds of thousands cheered his return, and Americans nationwide were upset over his dismissal. It was easy to understand why. MacArthur was the last of the American generals who had made national reputations during World War II to return home. As MacArthur arrived in Washington, criticism of the Truman administration rose to a fever pitch.
I believe that the President's action today in the removal of General MacArthur was a tragic mistake. I'm of the opinion it was caused by the President's failure to recognize the overall communist aggression, that it is global and international.
This is a tragic day for America. We do not know where we're going in Korea. We do not know where we're going in China. MacArthur knows, and he's been fired.
General MacArthur, well, I think he's a pretty good man.
Do you agree with President Truman in what he did?
No.
Senators McCarthy and Taft led the outcry. MacArthur was said to be the victim of a communist victory won with the aid of Bourbon and Benedictine. McCarthy was to add of Truman, the son of a bitch should be impeached. MacArthur, speaking to a joint session of Congress, was to use his considerable talent for dramatics to the utmost.
I am closing my 52 years of military service. When I joined the Army, even before the turn of the century, it was the fulfillment of all my boyish hopes and dreams. The world has turned over many times since I took the oath on the plain at West Point, and the hopes and dreams have long since vanished. But I still remember the refrain of one of the most popular barrack ballads of that day, which proclaimed most proudly that old soldiers never die. They just fade away. And like the old soldier of that ballad, I now close my military career and just fade away. An old soldier who tried to do his duty as God gave him the light to see that duty. Goodbye.
MacArthur's speech before Congress was a tour de force, an embattled general speaking to his countrymen. MacArthur sensed he had both public support and the upper hand. The Republicans, still smarting from the Truman victory of 1948, rallied to the cause. That there were glaring inconsistencies in the general's situation was not a cause for alarm to Republican strategists. Senator Taft found himself publicly supporting MacArthur while having voted to weaken the draft. Taft had also voted not to support NATO and to restrict the number of American troops being sent to Europe. Meanwhile, the press, sensing an anti-Truman tide, whipped the story to new heights of hysteria. Truman, again through his stunning upset in 1948, had made many enemies within the press. The press had been universally embarrassed after predicting a Dewey win in 1948, only to see Truman the victor. But the White House remained confident. Once the full story of the MacArthur episode was revealed, support for the general would dwindle. It was against this background that Senate hearings began concerning America's involvement in the Korean conflict. In the course of his Senate testimony, MacArthur began to paint a picture that differed radically from reality. He insisted that he and the Joint Chiefs of Staff had been in agreement on Korean policy, and that his decisions had been vetoed by none other than Secretary of Defense George Marshall. It was a simple case of misrepresentation. Headlines followed on MacArthur's testimony to the Senate, stating that MacArthur had been overruled by Marshall. MacArthur continued publicly to hammer away at America's China policy.
That from a military standpoint, the above views have been fully shared in past by practically every military leader concerned with the Korean campaign, including our own Joint Chiefs of Staff.
MacArthur was to testify that, quote, if I had been permitted to bomb them before they crossed the Yalu, they would never have crossed. But Senator Russell was to point out that, quote, it would have been a rather dangerous thing to have bombed them before they entered the war. MacArthur continued his attack on the administration and its policies. He was to blame the United States for the loss of China. He repeated his quest that nationalist China enter the war against the mainland Chinese. He undercut Ridgway by insisting that the Korean conflict could not be contained. MacArthur's last day before the Senate brought some hard questions from the young senator from Texas, Lyndon Johnson. Johnson asked what would occur if MacArthur's policies were pursued and the Chinese driven back to the Yalu River. What then? Was America prepared to fight a war which would take it into mainland China, and if so, how many troops would be required? MacArthur had no answer. Johnson had made his point. MacArthur's policies risked not just a war with China, but a conflict of immense proportion, conceivably greater than America's commitment during World War II. Next to testify was General Marshall. Marshall stated that, quote, "It became apparent that General MacArthur had grown so far out of sympathy with the established policies of the U.S. that there was grave doubt as to whether he could any longer be permitted to exercise authority." Marshall made it clear MacArthur had left the administration no choice but to replace him. Next to testify was General Omar Bradley, who attacked MacArthur's point that the nationalist Chinese be unleashed. Bradley pointed out that, quote, "Chiang Kai-shek is not accepted by a large portion of the Chinese. He had had a chance to win in China, and he had not done it." From a military point of view, Bradley made it clear Chiang's chances for victory on the mainland were no greater than they had been when he was defeated by the forces of Mao Zedong. Secretary of State Dean Acheson was next to testify, and he was quick to point out that America was in Korea to stop communist aggression. Part of the plan meant keeping China north of the 38th parallel. America sought no larger war. Acheson then went on to outline Chinese history. Chiang Kai-shek's weaknesses were well known. Acheson reminded Congress that the administration had asked for $570 million in military aid and had seen it cut to $400 million. Acheson stated that China had erred in entering the war. The war had cost the mainland Chinese Formosa, a seat in the UN, and a say in the Japanese peace treaty. Acheson saw major gains for the Western powers in the event. Said Acheson, "I think it brought home to people very strongly the extent of the danger that the world is facing. Clearly for America, the Cold War had come of age." The administration's gamble had paid off. Following the Senate hearings, support for MacArthur began to dwindle. The drama of MacArthur and Truman itself began to fade, as MacArthur himself became that old soldier who fades away. George Kennan met with the Soviet ambassador Malik as the U.S. moved to begin peace talks. Malik moved to make the Soviet position clear. Both sides seemed eager to find a way out of the confrontation. On July the 2nd, the Chinese agreed to begin peace negotiations. The talks would be long and difficult, but they had begun. By August, the talks had been broken off. The 8th Army had been re-equipped and reinforced, and now began a series of mass suicide attacks by the Chinese. The attacks failed, and China was soon back at the bargaining table.
The long-range objective of the United Nations in Korea is the creation of conditions that will ultimately make possible a Korea that is unified, master of its own destiny, and free of interference from any outside force. Meanwhile, the continuing presence and readiness of the United Nations forces in Korea constitute the only assurance we have of meeting the threat of renewed aggression if the peace talks should break down.
There were further problems. North Korean and Chinese POWs rioted at POW camps. At home, Truman was in trouble, his popularity having dropped drastically as a result of the war. The war and domestic scandal continued to rock the Truman administration. Truman announced publicly he would not seek another term.
Whoever the Democrats nominate for president this year, he will have this record to run upon. I shall not be a candidate for re-election. I have served my country long and I think efficiently and honestly. I shall not accept a renomination. I do not feel that it is my duty to spend another 4 years in the White House. War hero Dwight David Eisenhower would be the Republican nominee for president,
but not until a sharp fight had been fought with Senator Robert Taft, who had entered the nominating convention as the front runner. After years of pursuing the nomination, Taft was to see his chances for the presidency evaporate in the face of an I-like-Ike stampede. Eisenhower tapped the young Richard Nixon, who had made his name as a member of the House Un-American Activities Committee, as his running mate.
Ladies and gentlemen, you have summoned me on behalf of millions of your fellow Americans to lead a great crusade for freedom in America and freedom in the world. I know something of the solemn responsibility of leading a crusade. I have led one. I take up this task, therefore, in a spirit of deep obligation, mindful of its burdens and of its decisive importance. I accept your summons. I will lead this crusade. Our aims, the aims of this Republican crusade are clear: to sweep from an office an administration which has fastened on every one of us the wastefulness, the arrogance, and corruption in high places, the heavy burdens and the anxieties, which are the bitter fruit of a party too long in power.
The Democrats would nominate former Illinois Governor Adlai Stevenson. On October the 24th, Eisenhower announced, "I shall go to Korea," and thereby, for all practical purposes, secured himself the election. Eisenhower won by a landslide. For the first time in 20 years, America had a Republican president. Dwight David Eisenhower was sworn in as President of the United States on January the 20th, 1953. The war had drifted into a stalemate. Plans were being formulated to turn a larger portion of the war over to the South Koreans. On March the 5th, Premier Joseph Stalin died. He'd been premier of the Soviet Union for over 3 decades. Eisenhower saw his death as a potential opening for peace and hoped that the new leadership of the Soviet Union would be more inclined to seek peace. Another very significant development occurred in mid-January when the United States tested its first tactical nuclear weapon, a weapon suitable for use on the battlefield. On March 27th, the Joint Security Council threatened to use that weapon in Korea. Finally, on June 27, 1953, an armistice was agreed upon. The demarcation line would be the 38th parallel. After 3 years of fighting and over 33,000 Americans and many more Chinese and Korean dead, both sides would be back where they had started 3 years previously. South Korea remains a nation that is very faithful to the U.S. to this day. They would send troops to Vietnam and help us there. The situation has a darker side. Right-wing dictatorships have ruled South Korea throughout much of its history, and they remain to this day on Amnesty International's annual blacklist. For the Soviet Union, the Korean War must be viewed as a strategic disaster. The war caused the U.S. to rearm. Japan fell into the Western camp. NATO was formed. China was kept out of the UN. And Formosa was never to fall into the hands of the Communist Chinese. Stalin had gambled and lost. The war had grave consequences for the Chinese. They were never to unite their country. It would be over 2 decades before they were allowed into the UN. The war would set back Chinese development, and Soviet and Chinese relationships would never be quite the same. The war carried a heavy price for America. It ultimately led to the war in Vietnam, which would be a national disaster, and from which we are still recovering. It would give impetus to the McCarthy hearings, which would ruin the lives of thousands of Americans, depriving them of their ability to make a living in this country. Out of the Korean conflict would arise a military-industrial complex, which threatens to this day to spend us into oblivion and ruin our economy. There were no winners in the Korean War, only losers. It was, as Averell Harriman once put it, a sour little war.